Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Tracy Harris, and this is At Home in My Head, the podcast that explores experience and meaning and their impact on individuals and the broader society.
In history classes in the U.S., most of us went through the Red Scare and McCarthyism. What we recall may be different, but the gist of it was kind of wrapped up with a simultaneous effort of the House Un-American Committee. It was a panic that ruined the lives of a lot of citizens based purely on their political views that were critical of the U.S. government. Views which are supposed to be protected speech in the U.S., into which our government, theoretically, does not meddle, and for which citizens, theoretically, are not sanctioned. However, there are a lot of similar situations in U.S. history, even more modern history, which actually don't stop at history but are still ongoing to this day. They operate like a hydra. You cut off a head, and another one springs up to take its place. And this is the story of just one of those heads that was cut off. And before we celebrate, let me just say that another head sprang back up in its place, so let's not be too quick. In history classes, at least for most of us that I'm aware of, as always, I have to note that school curriculum in the U.S. is set at the state level, not the federal level, so your mileage may vary. But in general, it's fair to say that most of us were never taught about the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. And actually, I can't be too hard on the folks who write our history books because the CCIF was only active for a brief time during the 1970s. And by brief, I mean they really only did one thing that took place on one night. But sometimes it's about quality over quantity, and this was one of those times. What they did probably could not be replicated by a group of random citizens today. It was an incredible accomplishment, and it was completely illegal. But operating within the system, they could never have done it. But had they not exposed it, what they exposed would probably remain hidden to this day. In fact, I have no doubt what they exposed is still going on into the present day, under a different name and with better security, so as not to be exposed like this again. In the early 1970s, a small FBI satellite office in Media, Pennsylvania, was the target of a burglary. The thieves were after documents, and they found what they were looking for. They made off with over 1,000 classified documents, which they mailed to several U.S. newspapers in order to expose a long list of outrageous and completely illegal FBI operations that targeted law-abiding U.S. civilians who were legally exercising their rights, but who were critical of the U.S. government and policy, ironically on civil rights. John Raines, a former Freedom Rider, and one of the members involved in the break-in, was quoted in a 2014 interview saying that immediately after the break-in, the group called the news agency Reuters and provided them with the following statement over the phone. Quote, "On the night of March 8, 1971, the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI removed files from the Media, Pennsylvania office of the FBI. These files will now be studied to determine 1. The nature and extent of surveillance and intimidation carried on by this office of the FBI, particularly against groups and individuals working for a more just, humane, and peaceful society. 2. To determine how much of the FBI's efforts are spent on relatively minor crimes by the poor and the powerless against whom they can get a more glamorous conviction rate. Instead of investigating truly serious crimes by those with money and influence which cause great damage to the lives of many people, crimes such as war profiteering, monopolistic practices, institutional racism, organized crime, and the mass distribution of lethal drugs. Finally, 3. The extent of illegal practices by the FBI such as eavesdropping, entrapment, and the use of provocateurs and informers. As this study proceeds, the results obtained along with the FBI documents pertaining to them will be sent to people in public life who have demonstrated the integrity, courage, and commitment to democratic values which are necessary to effectively challenge the repressive policies of the FBI. As long as the United States government wages war against Indochina in defiance of the vast majority who want all troops and weapons withdrawn this year, and extends that war and suffering under the guise of reducing it, as long as the great economic and political power remains concentrated in the hands of a small clique not subject to democratic scrutiny and control, then repression, intimidation, and entrapment are to be expected. We do not believe that this destruction of democracy and democratic society results simply from the evilness, egoism, and senility of some leaders. Rather, this destruction is the result of certain undemocratic social, economic, and political institutions." End quote. As for the documents that they mailed to the news outlets, you might imagine that a news outlet being handed a stack of documents showing illegal abuses up to the highest levels of the U.S. government would be tripping over itself to publish this story before anyone else. But you'd be wrong. And in fact, they refused to publish the information. The justification was that it could dangerously expose agents and assets involved in ongoing operations. However, the Washington Post, not feeling any ethical concerns about exposing people illegally abusing U.S. citizens literally to death, verified the files were legit and then ran a front-page story in March of 1971, which then emboldened other outlets to do the same. In 1972, Win magazine, a small media outlet dedicated to anti-war effort, published the complete set of stolen documents, which revealed something called COINTELPRO, that's COINTELPRO, an acronym for Counterintelligence Program, which operated covertly between 1956 to 1971. Once exposed, Congress created the Church Committee, named for Idaho Democrat Senator Frank Church, to investigate. Some of the things that came out of the investigations beyond COINTELPRO's exposure were MK-Ultra, which may sound familiar. This was the program that drugged and tortured U.S. citizens in order to find methods of mind control. Family Jewels was another program discovered as well, which encompassed the CIA's program to assassinate foreign leaders. It also confirms something called signals intelligence was actually going on. Telecommunications companies were cooperating with the National Security Agency and providing them information about their customers. Basically, the collection of signals as intelligence. Today we think of this as more common, but back then this was new territory insofar as spying on average and, again, law-abiding citizens. Then President Gerald Ford tried to block release of the committee's findings, but failed. In the end, their output was voluminous. In April 1976, they released 6 books and 7 volumes of hearings records from the Senate proceedings. Before they released their final report, they exposed the assassination plots that involved world leaders from Zaire, the Dominican Republic, South Vietnam, Chile, and Cuba. The committee used this information to pressure Ford into issuing an executive order banning U.S.-sanctioned assassinations of foreign leaders. The committee also produced 7 case studies on covert operations, however, all but one were sealed at the request of the CIA. The information also showed the government keeping lists, much like we saw with McCarthy. The list housed millions of names, not all U.S. citizens, but still including thousands of U.S. citizens. As much as they released, much was not released, because a lot of it was classified. But over 50,000 pages were declassified, however, not until 1992. The CIA was opening citizen mail without warrants, unbeknownst to the post office. In fact, the CIA took steps to ensure that the post office was unaware. The committee investigated the assassination of President Kennedy and found that the federal investigation into that event was less than stellar. And I could go on and on about what the Church Committee found, but I want to go back to the specific case of COINTELPRO. Because while I understand not learning about the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, I don't understand how I got out of school learning about McCarthyism, but not recalling anything about COINTELPRO, which would have impacted my views on a great many organizations and individuals who were denigrated by people around me unfairly because of propaganda and smear campaigns that came out of this program that I never learned about. Speaking intuitively, just my thoughts, it almost seems like the Red Scare that McCarthy and the Un-American Committee were pursuing is a thing of the past. We really don't have a robust communist or socialist movement in the U.S., and I can't help thinking that maybe that makes it safe to talk about the Red Scare, because it successfully put down the movements that it targeted. Kind of like the Japanese internment camps. We can look back at it today critically because we aren't still doing it. It doesn't attack current U.S. policy or law or institutions. COINTELPRO, however, raises issues of current policy, and many of its targets, insofar as movements in the U.S., still exist. In fact, BLM gained a great deal of momentum just a few years ago, but was almost just as quickly put down, using tactics that are so similar to the COINTELPRO playbook that it's hard to ignore, including planting informants for information gathering and disruption into a movement that wasn't a threat to national security, but did threaten the current social order, something COINTELPRO was extremely concerned with during its tenure. Also, more recently, the way some Muslim movements, especially college student groups, were targeted after 9/11 has the familiar COINTELPRO feel. The illegitimate, unjustified infiltration and disruption of groups exercising a legal right to assembly and doing nothing illegal. To be clear, there is no arguing that federal law enforcement has done this. My speculation isn't that they did it, because they did, and that has been exposed. My speculation is that we don't hear as much about COINTELPRO in history classes as we do McCarthyism, because McCarthyism deals with targets that really are in the past, whereas the targets of COINTELPRO still exist in the present and are still being subjected to the same types of illegal surveillance and disruption, just not under the COINTELPRO label anymore. That is, if we had a strong communist party in the U.S. that was still being treated this way, would we be learning about Japanese internment camps, but not McCarthyism? And I honestly don't know. It's just something I think about. If the policies and tactics are still being employed against movements still deemed to threaten the social order, maybe we don't want those scenarios to become something citizens think too critically about. Noam Chomsky is a political activist and university professor of linguistics who actually worked with several others to create a document entitled COINTELPRO, The Untold American Story. It's available online in PDF format and was presented to the UN High Commission for Human Rights at the World Conference Against Racism in September 2001. Let me read here from the introduction to that document. Quote, "We are here to talk about the FBI and U.S. democracy because here we have this peculiar situation that we live in a democratic country. Everybody knows that, everybody says it, it's repeated, it's dinned into our ears 1,000 times. You grow up, you pledge allegiance, you salute the flag, you hail democracy, you look at the totalitarian states, you read the history of tyrannies, and here is the beacon light of democracy. And of course, there's some truth to that. There are things you can do in the United States that you can't do many other places without being put in jail. But the United States is a very complex system. It's very hard to describe because, yes, there are elements of democracy. There are things that you're grateful for, that you're not in front of a death squad in El Salvador. On the other hand, it's not quite a democracy, and one of the things that makes it not quite a democracy is the existence of outfits like the FBI and the CIA. Democracy is based on openness. and the existence of a secret policy, secret lists of dissident citizens, violates the spirit of democracy. Despite its carefully contrived image as the nation's premier crime-fighting agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has always functioned primarily as America's political police. This role includes not only the collection of intelligence on the activities of political dissidents and groups, but oftentimes counterintelligence operations to thwart those activities. The techniques employed are easily recognized by anyone familiar with military psychological operations. The FBI, through the use of the criminal justice system, the postal system, the telephone system, and the Internal Revenue Service, enjoys an operational capability surpassing even that of the CIA, which conducts covert actions in foreign countries without having access to those institutions." End quote. The report goes on to say, quote, "Of roughly 20,000 people investigated by the FBI solely on the basis of their political views between 1956 to 1971, about 10 to 15% were the targets of active counterintelligence measures per se. Taking counterintelligence in its broadest sense to include spreading false information, it's estimated that about 2/3 were COINTELPRO targets. Most targets were never suspected of committing any crime." Unquote. And I think this is the most shocking thing to me as I read about COINTELPRO. The vast majority of people they were surveilling were ordinary citizens working towards social change that would improve their lives and help them out of oppressed situations. And it would be egregious enough if it were surveillance alone. But it didn't just stop with surveilling people. Our federal law enforcement harassed them, framed them, even murdered them with the help of local police agencies and other tactics. In one instance, in 1969, an FBI agent stationed in San Francisco was surveilling the Black Panther chapter there. He reported to Hoover, the then head of the FBI, that he had observed the Black Panther Party was mainly focused on providing free breakfast to neighborhood children. You'd think this would be a relief to Hoover, to hear that the group wasn't plotting a militant race war, but instead was just catering to underprivileged families and children. But you'd be wrong. Hoover responded with a threat that if the agent wanted a future with the FBI, then he had better find some evidence to prove that the Black Panther Party was, quote, "a violence-prone organization seeking to overthrow the government by revolutionary means," unquote. In other words, after illegally surveilling the group and finding no wrongdoing, the response was, "Go find me some wrongdoing or your career is over." This sounds to me so much like the recording of Donald Trump instructing Georgia to just go back and look again and find him those 11,000 votes, or else they might be in legal trouble. What pains me here is that I grew up in a home where the propaganda of COINTELPRO impacted what I heard about Black civil rights movements and leaders. I believed this line that they were dangerous, violent, and militant. But if I'd have been more informed about COINTELPRO and their history and tactics, I would have recognized this was propaganda. I would have understood the difference between an angry tone as a response to social oppression and an angry tone of proactive aggression. Growing up, I was taught to understand the anger of the elitist and bigoted wealthy white men who founded the U.S. I was taught that a tax on tea was a bridge too far, and that of course you get militant with the government when they're disenfranchising you from power. But nobody ever encouraged me to think about what that means for groups within the U.S. who were disenfranchised from power. Sure, it was okay when President Lincoln went to war to end chattel race-based slavery, but prior to that, slave rebellions like Nat Turner's were put down by the government. The black slaves weren't allowed to revolt or do violence. Only the white supremacist system was allowed to determine the time and place where violence was legitimate. It reminds me so much of Martin Luther King Jr.'s words when he noted that the white moderates were more concerning than the KKK, saying, quote, "The white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action,' who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises to wait for a more convenient season." No one should be told to wait to be treated like a human being, though. People whose humanity isn't recognized, who are disenfranchised and pushed to the margins and denied resource access, are going to become angry. The harder they get squeezed, they're going to become violent. Again, to quote King, "Riot is the language of the unheard." We cannot ask people to suffer and die quietly simply because our laws legitimize some forms of violence and not others. When we legitimize violence against the oppressed, but outlaw violence in self-defense, we cannot be surprised when it breeds outrage at injustice. In the past week, for a modern example, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that educational institutions can discriminate against marginalized students, gay students, while taking tax dollars. But even educational institutions that do not take tax dollars are not allowed to consider the hardships overcome by marginalized students in the form of affirmative action. So even to this day, we legitimize violence against marginalized communities and support their oppression. And now we are beginning to outlaw any efforts to level the playing field to offset the oppression we openly and systemically commit against them. I had a friend who noted the hypocrisy in the affirmative action ruling because military institutions were specifically called out as exceptions. They are allowed to level the playing field to include more racial minorities. I pointed out there is no hypocrisy there if you understand the driving philosophy is racist oppression. It makes perfect sense for a white supremacist system to deny entry of those they oppress to institutions of higher learning. Legally denying the black population access to education is hardly a new thing in the U.S., while seeing them as perfectly suited to be used as cannon fodder. It's actually extremely consistent when the philosophy is understood as black lives don't matter as much as white ones. And I think about the folly in a nation that expects their open oppression to be peacefully and civilly tolerated. But when someone objects with more than words, if someone actually pushes back in a way that gains momentum or breaks a few windows, then we say they are militant and violent and animals that need to be dealt with harshly. We act shocked that these people think that they're above the law. But really, they just want the laws to be more justly and more equitably applied. I have no problem with anyone that sees an unjust law as a law they need to be above. Laws that oppress us or our neighbors should be considered illegitimate. When they are enforced with violence, we should understand that violent response is self-defense against an unjust system of oppression. And we should see this even when the people getting violent in response aren't the wealthy white men who founded the U.S. We were taught to empathize with white people who violently rebelled against a white system of oppression. But we're taught to buy into vilification of non-white citizens who rebel against a white system of oppression. But the people doing the oppression today should expect no less than what they gave in response to a time when they themselves felt oppressed. In summary, oppressing people is going to piss them off. So when we oppress, we don't get to claim the natural reaction of the pushback is somehow the real problem. But let's get back to COINTELPRO. And let's run through the tactics that they used. And again, as you hear this, try to keep in mind that these tactics were used primarily against people who weren't doing anything illegal. and were not even suspected of doing anything illegal. Ask yourself how this fits into the box of what law enforcement should look like when it's done to law-abiding citizens and political groups. The first tactic was something called infiltration. This was not, again, mere surveillance. It included actual direct interference. It was intended to discredit, disrupt, and cause negative results for the group's goals. It was intended to undermine public trust in the group and to dissuade people from sympathizing with or joining the cause. These are citizens and political activist groups exercising their rights to speech and association. Why is our law enforcement actively interfering with this? How is this enforcement of the law? And the next one as well. How is this justified as law enforcement? The second tactic is psychological warfare. The FBI fed fake news and even printed their own pamphlets pretending to be the groups they were targeting. They forged letters, sent anonymous letters and phone calls, and spread misinformation about group meetings and events. They even set up their own fake groups and coerced citizens into causing trouble for activists, people like school officials and landlords. They even pushed themselves onto some of the activists who refused to work with them and engaged them to make it look like they were working with the FBI. In some cases, this resulted in lethal violence. Again, when I think of law enforcement, I think of having some cause to believe that a group is doing something or planning something illegal. I think of a justified warrant for surveillance. I think of surveilling the group or using informants to gain information on activities. I think of doing this until it's determined that nothing illegal is going on or that something is going on, in which case an operation is set up to make appropriate arrest once there is enough information to do so. You watch the group and you arrest them if they're breaking laws. What I can't fathom is actually going in and creating chaos because the government simply disagrees with the group's goals for social change, which are not illegal. Again and again, I kept coming on to this concept of challenging the social order. In fact, it's from the Senate report that found the FBI's justification for COINTELPRO was, quote, protecting national security, preventing violence, and maintaining the existing social and political order, unquote. I mean, think about that. Maintaining the existing social and political order is why they were squashing activists and calls for change? Aren't we told all the time that we should use legitimate avenues for change? Exercise our due process and appeals to leadership, protest, speech, assembly, voting, etc.? But right here, we have an open admission that challenges to the existing social and political order will be dealt with using government enforcement to end it, even illegal enforcement. But what is activism if not an exercise of our right to change the existing social and political order? There is such a huge disconnect between what I was taught about the United States and the reality of what happens here. If we're going to be told to use legal avenues and nonviolent processes to change society, then groups and individuals who are using those avenues and processes should be left alone and allowed to exercise their rights and push for change. Not targeted for surveillance or harassment or violence at the hands of the government. Citizens who work toward change are not criminals. We're told we should not get violent because our society and laws allow for legal avenues for change. But what we see with COINTELPRO is that this was a lie, and that we actually disrupted and destroyed people and groups that promoted changes through legal means. The U.S. response was to unleash the power of the government in countless illegal and violent ways to put a stop to these citizens' efforts. And when legal efforts were thwarted and the targets expressed their anger, they were called militant and dangerous. I saw Donald Trump standing at the stump just yesterday on TV saying something about how leftists want to change the way of life in the U.S. They're going to change the way you live unless you elect Donald Trump to office. How does this square with what I was promised in school, that the beauty of the system is that we can change it? But what we have here is a system that is so impervious to change that most of the groups that were denied rights at the inception are still fighting for their rights to this day, almost 250 years later. If incremental change means civil wars and social violence and centuries of effort to still see yourself considered less than, then incremental change is simply setting the timetable for another person's freedom, dragging it out and asking the oppressed communities to wait a little longer in the suffering they endure. I mean, how the hell long are people supposed to be willing to wait for your incremental change? Especially when those saying wait are most often not those who are dying waiting. So in addition to propaganda and disruption from within, the third tactic was straight up using the legal system to harass people. You may remember some of this from the episodes on free speech, where the government brought suit against activists, arresting them, charging them, meanwhile having no case whatsoever. Still, the activists who were being accused of serious crimes had to hire lawyers and put their lives on hold and spend time and money and resources for an entire year only to see the government drop the case right before it was set to proceed. The goal wasn't to enforce the law. The authorities knew they had no case. The goal was harassment and intimidation. The government lost the battle, the trial, but they won the war, with all of the activists involved saying they never wanted to go through anything like that again. It wasn't a victory for the activists. It was an end to their activist careers. This is what I mean when I say we still see these same tactics today. COINTELPRO as a program was ended, but it continues under other programs. It was retired in name only. But under the documents that were exposed for COINTELPRO, we found that law officers perjured themselves and planted evidence in order to make false arrests and imprison people without actual cause. They also abused subpoena power, tax laws, and other legal regulations to harass people. And again, nothing says, I don't have the goods on you, like lying and faking your evidence. The fourth tactic identified was illegal force. This was cooperation between the FBI and local law enforcement, police departments. They broke into citizen homes and conducted illegal searches. They vandalized structures, they beat people, they even orchestrated and carried out assassinations. In one article, it said, quote, "The objective was to frighten or eliminate dissidents and disrupt their movements. It is so much of what we saw in the examples in Moskowitz's book on speech." And I also talked about some of this in the episode on Fred Hampton. This is still happening. These tactics are still being used. The fifth and final tactic listed was undermining public opinion. Again, why does law enforcement need to undermine public opinion? If someone is doing something illegal, surveil and arrest when you have the goods. Why is a propaganda war necessary? That's not law enforcement. That's what a government does when a group pushing for social change is making headway and the government doesn't want to openly oppose them, mainly because it's not supposed to meddle in legal public discourse. The government isn't supposed to be using enforcers to shut me down because I'm open about wanting political or social change. That threat to the social order is supposed to be a legal right to engage in. Pursuing or successfully achieving social change isn't illegal, and the FBI and the executive branch isn't supposed to be threatening and killing people for it. This is far outside their scope. But in undermining public opinion, the FBI actively attacked the reputations of activists and also stripped them of their platforms so they could not respond to defend themselves. Hoover, the same guy who told an agent that his career was over if he didn't find something violent happening in a group that was mainly feeding breakfast to kids in economically disadvantaged areas, also designed programs to stop activist leaders from, quote, spreading their philosophy publicly or through communications media, unquote. They also proactively put out negative propaganda to undermine black civil rights organizations. They went so far as to create documentaries that were edited to portray the BPP as aggressive. They even had news outlets publishing lies about individual members within the party, and the result was that the FBI successfully sowed distrust internally and between organizations and tarnished their public reputations. This reduced their ability to unify and rally public sympathy for their causes. Most people in the U.S. have heard of Kwanzaa. It was a festival created in 1966 as the first specifically African American holiday. It's generally celebrated around the time of Christmas and New Year's. What you may not know is that it was founded by Maulana Karenga, who, with Hakeem Jamal, cousin of Malcolm X, founded the US organization, a black empowerment group. They worked in the same areas as the Black Panther Party was operating in, and although the groups had different goals and methods, they were sometimes competing for membership. The FBI capitalized on this as a way to drive a deeper wedge between them. As part of COINTELPRO, they sent forged letters to each group claiming to be from the other. The intent of the letters was to give the impression that each group was working to publicly demean the other. The tactic worked, and the increased tension and animosity resulted in a shootout between the two groups on the UCLA campus in January 1969. John Huggins and Alprentice Carter were killed in the exchange, and the event led to retaliation that drove a back and forth of violence for months. Later that same year, in this context, 2 more BPP members were murdered and 1 injured by US members. The Los Angeles field office of the FBI issued an internal memo in the aftermath of these events that left 4 people dead. In it, they owned their role in encouraging these efforts and indicated they would be doing more to egg this on even further. Quote, "It is intended that US Inc. will be discreetly and appropriately advised of the time and locations of BPP activities in order that the 2 organizations might be brought together and thus grant nature the opportunity to take her due course." Unquote. Remember earlier when we read the justification for COINTELPRO? It was protecting national security, preventing violence, and maintaining the existing social and political order. How is greasing the wheels for shootouts preventing violence? I mean, really think about what's being said here. When I think of law enforcement, I think of their jobs as stopping mass shootings. That is, if they become aware that a shooting may take place, their role is to intercept that event and neutralize it, to avoid murders from happening. I would be appalled, for example, if documents were leaked that showed that the FBI were giving information to potential mass shooters to let them know which doors would be unlocked at certain times of day in an elementary school. This is not law enforcement. But if not for 7 people breaking U.S. laws, U.S. law enforcement would have gotten away with this and more, and none of us would ever even know about it. It took people violating the law to even let us know what was happening. And even now, it's still happening. We just know more about how to recognize it, and that this is how the U.S. addresses challenges to the social order. In the end, Karenga was arrested for assault and was imprisoned, coincidentally, until right after the US organization disbanded in 1974. Literally, the very next year, he was paroled, right after the organization he helped to found was dissolved. So clearly Hoover had a hate-on for the Black Panther Party, telling his agent to find the goods even if they're not there, driving a deeper wedge between BPP and the US organization, then handing US org a map to the BPP leadership in hopes of facilitating their murders. But there's more. Well, to be fair, there's so much more that I won't come close to covering the tip of this iceberg that was 15 years in the making. But Geronimo Pratt bears mentioning. Born Elmer Pratt, he was a decorated military veteran who did 2 tours of Vietnam and studied at UCLA before joining the Black Panther Party and rising through the ranks to a position of leadership within the organization. In the FBI documentation, it says that Pratt was targeted for the purpose of neutralizing him, quote, as an effective BPP functionary, unquote. So he wasn't targeted for committing a crime. He was just an effective organizer and activist working toward social change, which we're all supposed to be able to do. Think about this messaging. You're allowed to speak and assemble and push for social change as long as you aren't effective at it. When you become effective, well, let's see what happens. Pratt's history was pretty all-American, to be honest. His dad was an independent business owner. He was raised Catholic. He played football in high school, and in fact, he was the quarterback. As previously mentioned, he joined the military, did 2 tours in Vietnam, where he came out a decorated veteran. He earned 2 Bronze Stars, a Silver Star, and 2 Purple Hearts. After the military, he used the GI Bill to go to UCLA, where he studied political science. He became politically active and joined the Black Panther Party. Because of his background, he rose to Deputy Minister of Defense within his local chapter. The 2 men who had recruited him were Bunchy Carter and John Huggins, the very same Carter and Huggins who were murdered as part of the COINTELPRO infiltration of the US organization. Pratt adopted the nickname Geronimo because he admired the Apache chief's resistance to U.S. domination. In 1970, the Los Angeles FBI office was seeking permission from national headquarters to challenge Pratt's legitimacy and authority within the BPP. And again, I'm asking what this has to do with law enforcement. In 1968, a 27-year-old school teacher, Caroline Olson, was shot to death during a robbery in Santa Monica. Her husband was with her and was also shot but survived. He identified Pratt from a lineup. Then Julius Butler, a police informant and infiltrator in the BPP, said that Pratt confessed that he had committed the murder. Pratt was arrested and charged with kidnapping and murder. His attorney, John Cochran, argued that the charges should be dropped because Pratt was 350 miles away the night of the murder. But in 1972, Pratt was convicted. It was later reported that the FBI had moles in the defense camp and was monitoring Cochran's phone calls. While in prison, Pratt studied law and worked on his own defense with 2 lawyers, one of which had worked with him on his original defense. In June 1997, 25 years after his conviction, that conviction was vacated because it was shown that the prosecution had concealed exculpatory evidence. In fact, the police had actual wiretap recordings that proved that Pratt was at a Black Panther meeting in Oakland, 400 miles away from the murder in LA at the time it happened. The prosecution had also failed to disclose that their key witness, Julius Butler, was an FBI and LAPD informant. The state appealed, but in 1999, the appeals court upheld vacating the conviction based on this discovery, and Pratt was finally released. In 1998, Pratt worked with Cochran to file a civil suit against the FBI and the LAPD for malicious prosecution and false imprisonment. The suit was settled for $4.5 million. The city of Los Angeles paid $2.75 million, and the U.S. Department of Justice paid the remaining $1.75 million. Until his death in 2011, Pratt continued to work for people who were wrongly convicted. Most of what I talked about during this episode was COINTELPRO and the impact on Black civil rights, specifically the Black Panther Party. And I do think Hoover had a particular hatred of the group for reasons of his own. But it certainly wasn't that the group was doing horrible things or trying to run afoul of the law. In statements explicitly made in documentation on the tactics employed against BPP, it sounds pretty clear that the prevailing motivation seems to have been that they were effectively promoting social justice for the Black community and on their way to effect real social change, something that clearly was not acceptable to federal and local law enforcement. There are actually even more stories, specifically involving Martin Luther King Jr., that are even more disturbing. It's just hard to dig into this information like we did with Fred Hampton's story and not wonder over every assassination that happened during that time. COINTELPRO, as far as I'm concerned, bears responsibility for the conspiracy theories that swirl around murders during that era. When your files are filled with your instigation of violence with the goal of getting key people in leadership assassinated or otherwise neutralized, when there seems to be no bar you're not willing to lower, when this is what your own documentation exposes. I mean, what if that break-in had not happened and someone was telling you that from their inside experience, this is how the FBI and local law enforcement are operating? They would sound paranoid to the average citizen watching from the sidelines. It reminds me of that old Latin line about who's watching the watchers. Last time I went on an hour and a half, and this time I'm trying to keep it within the hour. I can't promise, but I think it would be interesting to do more of these cases out of the COINTELPRO files, and also talk about the infiltration of BLM and the Muslim youth groups on campuses that were similarly exposed and that mirrored these tactics. At any rate, I at least feel like I did something productive with my July 4th holiday. There's an irony to using that particular date to have the time to script an episode that talks about the illegitimacy of U.S. government tactics towards citizens. Or maybe I'm the only one who finds that funny. I still need to record this and release it, which, by the time you're hearing it, I will have done. Take care of yourselves and each other out there. It's a group effort.
That's it for this episode of At Home in My Head, exploring experience and meaning in individuals and the broader society. Like and subscribe if you enjoy these talks, and in the meantime, stay safe, be well, and never stop exploring.